The September rain pattered against the windows of the Caldwell mansion in Boston with a melancholic persistence, each drop echoing like the unshed tears Eleanor had never allowed to fall. The rhythmic sound mingled with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, creating a symphony of farewell that accompanied her final moments in that gilded life that had become an ornate prison. Her delicate hands, accustomed to fine French embroidery and the pages of leather-bound books, trembled slightly as she folded the last navy blue silk dress, the one she had worn at the last charity ball of the season, when she still believed she could find ways to be useful within the confines of her social class. The discreet trunk at the foot of the mahogany bed would hold not only clothes, but the carefully selected fragments of a life she had chosen to abandon, like a butterfly leaving its chrysalis. The room she had inhabited for nearly 3 decades breathed silent elegance. French wallpaper in shades of pale pink and gold, damask curtains that filtered the grey light of the rainy afternoon, polished fine wood furniture that gleamed like mirrors. Each object told a story of privilege. The Venetian mirror that had reflected 1,000 elaborate hairstyles, the desk where she had penned polite letters to suitors approved by her father, the bookshelf filled with volumes of poetry that had fueled her secret dreams of freedom, the jasmine scent that permeated her batiste handkerchiefs mixed with the aroma of beeswax from imported tallow candles, creating an atmosphere of solemn farewell that made her heart race with a strange mix of terror and anticipation. Eleanor, Ellie as she preferred to be called away from the aristocratic parlors where her full name was pronounced with affected reverence, adjusted for the 10th time the yellowed map that her Uncle James had entrusted to her before leaving for the West on an expedition that would be his last adventure. The pencil marks on the faded paper seemed to whisper promises of freedom among mountains she had never seen, but which already inhabited her most intimate dreams like cathedrals of stone and ice, where a woman could breathe clean air and make decisions that were truly her own. Uncle James had always been the rebellious member of the Caldwell family, the one who chose adventure over responsibility, exploration over stability. His letters from Colorado arrived scented with the aromas of pine and freedom, describing a world where a person's worth was measured by their actions, not by their surname. "Milady, your father requests your presence in the library." The voice of Martha, the Irish maid who had served her since childhood, came through the solid oak door like a conspiratorial whisper. Martha knew of the young mistress's plans. It was she who had helped Eleanor discreetly sell her jewels in the less reputable part of town, turning diamond bracelets and pearl brooches into enough money to pay for a journey that would change her life forever. Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing herself one last moment of hesitation. She could still change her mind, unpack her bags, accept the destiny that had been charted for her since birth. She could be the obedient wife of Cornelius Blackwood, decorate his house with the same cold elegance as this one, raise children who would follow the same pattern of unquestioning existence. She could continue to be Eleanor Caldwell, exemplary daughter, social ornament, a piece in the power game of rich men. But when she opened her eyes and saw the storm outside bending the trees in the garden, she knew there was no turning back. Some seeds only germinate when the familiar earth is left behind. On the other side of the carved oak door, the final conversation with Judge Henry Caldwell awaited her, a man of integrity in the eyes of Bostonian society, respected in courts and exclusive clubs, but whose rigid convictions imprisoned his daughter's free spirit, like golden cages imprison wild birds, born to fly over infinite mountains. She descended the stairs in silence, each cold Italian marble step under her soft leather boots custom-made in London. Her silk skirts whispered against the mahogany railing, creating a gentle music that accompanied her descent to what she knew was her last act as Eleanor Caldwell. The mansion stretched around her like an elegant mausoleum, paintings of illustrious ancestors watching her with painted eyes that seemed to judge her decision. Crystal chandeliers reflecting fragments of light that danced on the walls like hopes about to be realized. The library smelled of French cognac and old parchment, masculine aromas that had once brought her comfort as a child, but which now suffocated like unfulfilled promises of a life that would never be truly hers. The shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, and also centuries of traditions that she was about to break like invisible chains. How could she explain to her father that she preferred the uncertainty of the icy mountains to the suffocating luxury of a loveless marriage? How could she make him understand that her soul yearned for genuine purpose, not for social position. How could she say that for the first time in her life she wanted to be judged for who she was, not for what she possessed? The conversation that would follow would define not only her future, but the type of woman she would choose to be, the one who bowed to the expectations of others, or the one who dared to forge her own destiny in the icy forges of distant mountains. Judge Caldwell lifted his eyes from the Boston Herald with a deliberately slow movement, his thick graying eyebrows furrowed in silent disapproval that Eleanor had known since childhood. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls clad in dark wood imported from England, creating a solemn atmosphere that perfectly matched the seriousness of the moment. Eleanor remained at the entrance to the library, her hands clasped in front of her body, in a posture she had learned from an early age, apparent submission masking a steely determination that pulsed in her veins like rebellious blood. Her father's study was a masculine sanctuary of power and tradition, a polished bronze globe where he charted commercial routes, framed maps of family properties scattered throughout New England, oil portraits of judges and magistrates who preceded him in his career. The scent of leather from the law books mingled with the woody aroma of the cigar he had smoked after dinner, creating a combination that defined the masculine spaces of power in Boston. "Eleanor, sit down." The grave voice echoed between the shelves filled with volumes of jurisprudence and political treatises, laden with the authority he exercised in the courts, and which he expected to exercise over his daughter's life. "Cornelius Blackwood has confirmed the wedding preparations. The ceremony will be in 3 weeks at Christ Church. Reverend Morrison will officiate, and the city's most important families have already confirmed their attendance." Eleanor approached the dark green velvet armchair, the same one she had sat in as a child to listen to stories of Uncle James's adventures, but did not sit. She remained standing, a small silent rebellion that did not go unnoticed by her father's shrewd eyes. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, and she fixed her eyes on the flames, seeking courage in the hypnotic dance of the elements that reminded her of the bonfires described in Uncle James's letters, lit under the starry skies of Colorado. "Father, there's something I need to tell you." Her voice came out firmer than she expected, charged with a resolution that strengthened with each word. "I cannot marry Mr. Blackwood." The silence that followed was dense as the morning mist of the harbor, laden with unsaid tensions and broken expectations. Judge Caldwell closed the newspaper with deliberately slow movements, each fold of the paper echoing like a premonition in the stillness of the library. He removed his reading glasses, wiped them with a white linen handkerchief, and put them back on his nose, a ritual that Eleanor recognized as a prelude to serious confrontations. "And for what reason, my daughter, would you refuse such an advantageous union?" His voice maintained the measured tone he used in court, but Eleanor perceived the growing irritation beneath the apparent calm. "Cornelius is respected in society, prosperous beyond any need, and offers stability that few women have the privilege of knowing. You will be mistress of one of Boston's largest fortunes." Eleanor took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of leather from the books as if it were liquid strength. The words that formed on her lips had been mentally rehearsed for weeks, polished until they shone like precious stones of undeniable truth. "Because I do not love him, Father, and because I have discovered that there are worlds beyond these gilded walls, places where a woman can be useful for her compassion, not just for her fortune or family connections." Her voice grew in conviction with each syllable. "Places where a person's worth is measured by their actions, not by their lineage." Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed, and Eleanor knew he had discovered her secret activities. The anonymous contributions to needy families, the discreet visits to orphanages in the poor neighborhoods, the clandestine meetings with women fleeing abusive situations. She had been careful, but not enough to completely escape the network of information that men like her father maintained about everything that happened in their sphere of influence. "You do not understand the consequences of your ill-advised charities, Eleanor." His voice now carried a coldness she knew well, the tone he used to deliver life-changing sentences. "The Caldwell name must remain untouched. There are responsibilities that come with our position, obligations to our class and our place in society. Your reckless actions have already attracted unwanted attention. Then perhaps it is time for the Caldwell name to represent something more than just privilege and conformity," Eleanor retorted, surprising herself with her own audacity. "Perhaps it is time to use our position to effectively help those in need, instead of simply keeping up appearances at charity balls where money is raised only to ease guilty consciences." Judge Caldwell's face flushed red, a color Eleanor had rarely seen. He rose from behind the desk, his hands resting on the polished wood with enough force to whiten his knuckles. Eleanor Caldwell, you have completely forgotten your place in society and your filial obligations. Cornelius Blackwood is a respected businessman, with connections that will benefit our family for generations. This marriage is not just a personal union, it is a strategic alliance that will consolidate our position and influence. And what am I? The question came out as a wounded whisper. What am I in this strategic alliance? A commodity to be traded? A stamp of approval for commercial transactions? You are my daughter, and you will do what is best for this family. The finality in his voice was like a door closing. The ceremony will proceed as planned. I suggest you use these 3 weeks to accept your destiny, with the dignity befitting a Caldwell. But would it be too late when he discovered that his daughter had already chosen a destiny where the Caldwell name would mean nothing more than a distant memory, and where dignity would be defined not by submission, but by the courage to choose her own path? Eleanor made a formal curtsy, not of submission, but of farewell. Good night, Father. When she left the library and climbed the stairs for the last time as Eleanor Caldwell, she felt curiously light, as if she had left an immense weight in the room below. Martha was waiting for her in the bedroom, the trunk already closed and ready, her maternal eyes shining with tears of pride and concern. Are you sure about this, milady? The faithful maid whispered. Eleanor looked out the window at the storm still raging outside, bending the trees and testing their resistance. As sure as those trees know they have to bend so they don't break. The morning would bring her escape, but that night she slept for the last time among silk sheets embroidered with initials that would soon no longer be hers. The locomotive's steam mixed with the cold mist of dawn when Eleanor, now Mary Sullivan, according to the carefully forged documents Martha had managed to get through contacts in the Irish community, waited on the platform of South Station. The morning air smelled of burnt coal, heated iron, and the dreams of hundreds of people who, like her, were seeking new beginnings in the distant lands of the American West. Her heart thumped with an irregular rhythm, like a caged bird testing the bars of its prison for the first time, discovering that the world beyond the bars was simultaneously terrifying and wonderful. She had left the mansion before dawn, leaving only a letter on the pillow, carefully chosen words that explained her decision without revealing her destination, asking for forgiveness without apologizing for choosing freedom. The brown leather suitcase at her feet, a simple piece that contrasted drastically with the French brand luggage she used to carry, held not only practical and simple clothes, but also the last vestiges of her former life, a miniature of her deceased mother, painted when Eleanor was still a baby, wrapped in light blue silk, yellowed letters from her Uncle James, filled with poetic descriptions of the Colorado mountains that shone like crystals kissed by eternity, and a small book of Emily Dickinson poems that gave her courage during moments of uncertainty. The train station bustled with the typical energy of great departures. Passengers moved around her like pieces of an elaborately choreographed morning ballet. Merchants in their dark suits, carrying product samples they hoped to sell in the growing towns of the West. Entire families with faces marked by hope and fatigue, carrying hopes and fears in worn-out trunks that contained everything they owned in the world. Young adventurers with bright eyes turned to the unknown horizon where fortunes were made and lost as quickly as the weather changed. Eleanor watched each face, each gesture, imprinting these last images of the world she knew in her memory. A mother adjusted her small son's hat, whispering words of encouragement. An elderly man read a letter for the last time before carefully putting it in his waistcoat pocket. 2 young women said goodbye with hugs and tears, promising to write every week. Each scene was a small human drama that deeply touched her, reminding her that she was not alone in her search for something different, something true. "Train to Denver! All aboard!" the conductor shouted, his rough voice cutting through the cold, humid Boston morning air. "Next stop, Albany." 3-day trip to Denver. Eleanor adjusted her simple grey felt hat, so different from the elaborate French models adorned with feathers and ribbons she used to wear on walks along Commonwealth Avenue, and firmly held the handle of her suitcase. Each step toward the car took her not only physically away from Boston, but symbolically away from the Eleanor Caldwell she had been, the obedient daughter, the society lady, the decorative piece in the masculine power game. The woman who was climbing those iron steps was Mary Sullivan, of humble origin, raised on a farm in Iowa, an orphan seeking a new life as a mail-order bride to a farmer named Nathaniel Blackthorne. She had carefully studied the details of this identity, creating a convincing personal history that would explain any slip that might reveal her true education or origin. The interior of the car smelled of varnished wood and new fabrics, with seats upholstered in faded red velvet that had already known thousands of stories of people seeking new destinations. Eleanor found her place near a window, settling her small luggage in the compartment above with the help of a middle-aged gentleman who was traveling with his wife to meet their son in a mining town in Colorado. "First time out west, my dear?" The wife, a kind lady with grey hair arranged in an elegant bun, asked. "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor replied, remembering to modulate her voice to sound less refined. "I'm going to marry a farmer in Colorado." "Oh, how wonderful! Love takes us to the most unexpected places, doesn't it?" The lady smiled with genuine joy. "My Henry and I married 30 years ago, and I still remember the excitement of starting our life together." Eleanor smiled back, touched by the woman's sincerity. "I hope it will be that way for me too." The wheels began to turn with a metallic groan that sounded like music of liberation to her. The train moved slowly at first, gradually gaining speed, and through the condensation-fogged window, Eleanor saw Boston turn into a blurred watercolor of greys and browns. The red brick buildings, the church spires, the well-tended gardens where she had played as a child, all shrinking until they completely disappeared around the bend in the railway. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, silently saying goodbye to the only life she had ever known. There was no turning back. For the first time at 32, she was truly alone in the world, depending only on her own courage and determination. Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed the rhythmic swaying of the train to lull her as unknown landscapes paraded beyond the window. In the letters exchanged with Nathaniel during the last 2 months, he had described Silver Creek as a town where the sky touches the mountains and men still believe that a word given is worth more than a signed contract. Would it be true, or just poetry from a lonely man seeking companionship in the wild lands? His letters were different from the formal correspondence she was used to receiving from her father's approved suitors. Nathaniel wrote about the sunrise painting the mountains gold and pink, about the deep silence of the starry nights, about the simple satisfaction of honest work that nourished not only the body, but also the soul. There was a depth in his words that awakened something dormant in Eleanor's heart, the hope that there were men capable of seeing a woman as a partner, not as an ornament. The train continued its journey through New England, passing through small towns where people waved from the windows of simple houses, crossing forests that stretched to the horizon, crossing rivers that ran free toward the sea. Each mile took her farther from everything she knew and closer to an uncertain but her own future. 3 days of travel would separate her from all the answers and from the biggest gamble of her life. Would Nathaniel Blackthorne be the man from his letters? Would she find in the icy mountains of Colorado the home her restless soul had always sought? Or would she discover that she had traded one golden prison for another, just in a different setting? As the train followed its inexorable course to the west, Eleanor Mary Sullivan looked at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky and made a silent promise. No matter what she found in Colorado, she would never again allow anyone to define her life for her. Freedom had a price and she was willing to pay it. The Colorado cold cut like a sharp razor through the fabric of her coat when Eleanor Mary stepped off at the small Silver Creek station, her feet touching the rocky ground of the Rocky Mountains for the first time. The thin air of the high altitudes made her lungs protest, accustomed as they were to the salty humidity of the Atlantic Ocean and the atmospheric density of sea level. Each breath was a physical reminder of how far she had traveled, not only in miles, but in entire worlds of experience. Snowflakes danced lazily from the leaden sky, landing on her shoulders like icy blessings from a completely new world, a world where the horizon stretched infinitely between snow-capped peaks that touched the clouds. The contrast with Boston was so dramatic that Eleanor needed a moment to absorb the wild magnificence that surrounded her, mountains that rose like cathedrals of stone and ice, pine forests that whispered ancient secrets, a sky so vast that it made her soul feel simultaneously small and expansive. The station was nothing more than a crude wooden building worn by the weather, with only a few people waiting under the protection of the small corrugated metal roof. The characteristic smell of the mountains, pure air mixed with the aromas of pine, cold earth, and fresh snow, was intoxicating after years of breathing the urban odors of Boston, smoke from industrial chimneys, salt from the harbor, artificial perfumes from parlors. Eleanor searched with her eyes for a man who matched the description in the letters carefully filed in her handbag. Tall, Dark hair, a scar on his left forehead from a youthful horse accident, blue eyes described as the color of ice on winter lakes. Her heart quickened when she spotted an imposing figure leaning against a wooden post, a black wide-brimmed hat pulled over his eyes, a relaxed posture that contrasted with an underlying watchfulness that spoke of a man accustomed to environments where observation could mean the difference between life and death. Nathaniel Blackthorne lifted his head as she approached with hesitant steps, and Eleanor felt the already thin air become even scarcer in her lungs. His eyes were exactly as described in the letters, an intense blue like the ice on the lakes in the mountains, but they carried a depth that the written words could never convey, a complexity that spoke of experiences that would never fit into polite correspondence exchanged between strangers. There was something magnetic about his physical presence, a mix of natural authority and genuine kindness that made her instinctively understand why she had been attracted to his letters even without meeting him in person. He was as tall as he had promised, easily a head taller than her, with broad shoulders that filled his leather coat with natural authority, but his movements were economical, graceful, speaking of a man comfortable in his own body and environment. "Miss Sullivan?" His voice was low, modulated, with an accent that mixed refined education with the rusticity of the open lands, another intriguing contradiction in a man who clearly held more layers than he had revealed in his letters. "Yes, Mr. Blackthorne." Eleanor gave a slight curtsy, consciously remembering to maintain the simple posture that befitted Mary Sullivan, the daughter of Iowa farmers. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." He approached with steps that created soft echoes on the wooden platform, and she noticed other details that the letters didn't mention: the scar on his forehead that gave character to his face, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who spent a lot of time outdoors, observing distant horizons, the large hands clearly accustomed to physical work, but with long, elegant fingers that suggested other skills besides ranching. When he took her leather suitcase with automatic gentleness, his fingers briefly brushed against hers through the simple wool gloves she was wearing, and Eleanor felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with the dry mountain air. It was a completely new sensation, not the repulsion she felt when Cornelius Blackwood touched her hand at social functions, but something warm and unsettling that made her heart race alarmingly. "The way to the ranch is long, and the snow might get heavier before nightfall," Nathaniel explained, gesturing to a sturdy wagon pulled by two solid-looking brown horses, clearly animals accustomed to heavy work on difficult terrain. "I hope you don't mind the rusticity. These mountains don't forgive those who don't prepare properly for their mood swings." There was a genuine care in his voice, a concern for her well-being that contrasted dramatically with the way men in Boston treated women as delicate objects that needed to be protected, but rarely consulted about their own needs or comfort. Eleanor climbed into the wagon with the help of his firm hand, settling onto the wooden seat covered with simple but well-made cushions. He offered her a thick wool blanket that smelled of pine and fireplace smoke, masculine and natural aromas that awakened in her sensations completely foreign to the perfumed and artificially delicate environment of her father's mansion. "This blanket was made by—" Nathaniel began, then stopped, as if he had touched on sensitive territory. "By someone who knew these mountains' winters well." Eleanor noticed the hesitation and wondered about the story behind that blanket. Who had made it? Why Nathaniel seemed reluctant to talk about it? Another mystery in an equation that already contained too many mysteries. As the wagon pulled away from the small town toward the snow-capped mountains, Eleanor discreetly watched Nathaniel's profile as he competently drove the horses. There was something in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a shadow, an old pain, a loss that the polite letters had never revealed. There were also moments when he looked at the mountains with the expression of a man who saw more than a landscape, who saw home, purpose, memories that could be both comforting and painful. The landscape that unfolded around them was of breathtaking wild beauty. Snow-covered pines created geometric patterns against the grey sky. Gigantic rocks emerged from the snow like natural sculptures, and in the distance, mountain peaks were lost among low clouds. The silence was deep, broken only by the creaking of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic snorting of the horses, and the whispering of the wind among the pines. "It's even more beautiful than you described in your letters," Eleanor murmured, momentarily forgetting to control the natural refinement of her voice. Nathaniel looked at her with renewed curiosity. "You have an interesting way of expressing yourself, Miss Sullivan. Formal education?" Eleanor felt her heart race. "No, Mr. Blackthorne, I always liked to read when I could get my hands on books. Please call me Nate, he said with a smile that completely transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a man capable of great tenderness. And you? May I call you Mary? Of course. The name sounded strange in her own ears, like borrowed clothes that didn't fit perfectly, but that would have to do. What secrets did those silent mountains hold, and what mysteries hid behind the ice-blue eyes of the man who had become her last hope for freedom? And how long would it be before her own mask began to slip, revealing Eleanor Caldwell beneath the carefully constructed facade of Mary Sullivan? The following days established a rhythm completely different from what Eleanor had known in her entire privileged life. It was a rhythm marked not by the hands of the grandfather clock in her father's mansion, or by the carefully orchestrated social engagements of Boston, but by the natural cycles of sunlight, the seasons, the genuine needs of animals and land that did not care about social position or artificial schedules. Eleanor woke up naturally, with the first ray of sun filtering through the simple but well-made curtains of the room Moses had prepared for her on the upper floor of the house, a small but extraordinarily cozy space with a window that offered a panoramic view of the mountains and a bed with a patchwork quilt that told stories in each square of carefully hand-stitched fabric. Through the window, she watched Nate feeding the horses in the corrals, his economical and precise movements revealing years of intimate experience with the animals and absolute comfort in physical work. He spoke to the horses in a low voice, almost whispering words that Eleanor could not hear but could feel by the tone. Gentle, reassuring, respectful. The horses responded with absolute confidence, as if they understood not only his words, but his thoughts and intentions. There was a masculine poetry in his movements that Eleanor had never observed in the gentlemen of Boston, who were accustomed to having servants for all physical tasks. Nate carried bundles of hay with natural strength, mended fences with practical competence, and rode horses with a grace that spoke of a genuine partnership between man and animal. It was honest work that gave visible purpose and authentic satisfaction, something Eleanor was beginning to understand she had never experienced in her life of empty privileges. Eleanor went down to help Moses in the kitchen, gradually discovering that her domestic skills, although severely limited by the sheltered life she had led, were sufficient for the genuinely simple needs of the ranch. Moses patiently taught her the secrets of mountain cooking, how to make bread that wouldn't dry out in the thin air of the high altitudes, how to preserve meats for the long winters when fresh supplies were scarce, how to prepare natural remedies with the wild herbs that grew on the slopes. The first Mrs. Blackthorne knew all these things, Moses told her one morning, while demonstrating how to prepare an ointment for minor cuts and wounds, his experienced hands moving with precision, learned through years of practice. Sarah Moonfeather. Pretty name for a pretty woman, don't you think? Moonfeather? Eleanor stopped stirring the mixture of herbs and beeswax, intrigued by the poetry of the name and its obvious origins. It's an indigenous name, isn't it? Moses nodded, his eyes becoming distant with memories he clearly held with fondness and sadness. She was Ute. She met the boss when he was still serving in the army as a cavalry officer. It was love at first sight, at least that's what everyone said. She taught him to see these mountains not as territory to be conquered and dominated, but as a home to be respected and protected. Eleanor absorbed this crucial information in respectful silence, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. In the formal letters exchanged with Nate during the months of correspondence, he had briefly mentioned that he had been married before, but had never gone into detail about the deceased wife or the circumstances of her loss. To imagine that he had fallen in love with an indigenous woman revealed layers of social and emotional complexity that she had not expected to find in this seemingly straightforward man. It also explained some of the details she had noticed in the house, the appreciation for natural beauty, the harmony with the environment, the indigenous artifacts arranged with respect rather than as curiosities. Nathaniel Blackthorne had been educated not only by books and formal education, but by the wisdom of a culture completely different from the dominant white society. In the afternoon, while Eleanor mended a torn shirt of Nate's, a task that brought back touching memories of her mother, teaching her embroidery on cozy Boston evenings, when life still seemed safe and predictable, she heard low voices coming from the main stable. Curiosity overcoming caution, she discreetly approached the window and saw Nate talking intensely with a young Indian man, both leaning over maps spread over bundles of hay. The young man seemed agitated, gesturing with urgency toward the distant mountains, While Nate listened with a grave expression that Eleanor was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions with potentially dangerous consequences. There was an urgency in that conversation, something that transcended the routine matters of a cattle ranch, something that spoke of responsibilities and risks far beyond agriculture and ranching. Eleanor moved away from the window when she realized her presence might be intrusive, her heart racing with questions she could not ask directly. What secret matters occupied Nathaniel Blackthorne besides raising animals? What responsibilities had he taken on that required clandestine meetings and careful planning? And how long would it be before he discovered that she also held secrets that could completely change everything between them? Secrets that could destroy the careful trust that was being built, or that could create even deeper bonds based on a shared understanding of what it meant to risk everything for principles that transcended personal safety. The mountains around the ranch seemed to whisper with voices that Eleanor was only beginning to hear, and each day revealed new layers of mystery that made her realize she had stumbled into a much more complex and potentially dangerous situation than she had ever imagined when she decided to flee Boston in search of simple love and a peaceful life. The first serious snowfall of the season arrived without adequate warning, as often happened in the mountains where weather patterns could change with devastating speed, transforming the world into an impressionistic watercolor of pure whites and silvery grays that stretched to the infinite horizon. Eleanor woke up one morning to find that the windows were completely covered with crystallized ice in delicate and intricate patterns like Venetian lace, and that the deep silence of the snow had swallowed all the familiar sounds of the ranch. The horses' whinnies, the cattle's mooing, even the constant whispering of the wind among the pines. The world had suddenly become muffled and intimate, as if a giant blanket had been carefully spread around the entire landscape, creating a natural sanctuary against the harsh realities of the outside world. It was both beautiful and slightly ominous, the beauty of nature in its most spectacular display, but also a reminder of the power of forces beyond human control. It could last for days, Nate explained during breakfast in a kitchen warmed by the wood stove that Moses had fed with thick logs of resinous pine, the flames dancing hypnotically behind the iron door. When storms arrive like this, without adequate warning, it's best to prepare to be completely isolated from the rest of the world. The roads become impassable, and even a man on horseback would be reckless to try to get to town. Eleanor couldn't hide a shiver, not from cold, as the house was wonderfully warm, but from a strange and confused anticipation she didn't know how to name properly. The idea of being confined with Nate for an indefinite number of days awakened contradictory feelings of nervousness and anticipation in her, a mixture of emotions completely unknown in her experience. At night, while the wind howled around the house like a lonely wolf looking for shelter, the three inhabitants gathered in the main room in a scene of domestic tranquility that Eleanor found deeply moving. Moses mended leather harnesses under the constant yellow light of the lantern, his fingers working with skill acquired through decades of practice, while Nate read a bound volume of poetry, a surprise that Eleanor did not expect, and that revealed yet another layer of complexity in the man she thought she was beginning to understand. Eleanor occupied a chair near the fire, embroidering a handkerchief with intricate patterns she had learned from her mother during those peaceful evenings in Boston that now seemed to belong to another life entirely. The needlework gave her familiar comfort and kept her hands busy while her mind processed the strange new realities of her situation. "You read Wordsworth?" Eleanor asked, recognizing the distinctive green cover of the volume in Nate's hands. The question escaped before she could censor herself, revealing more familiarity with literature than Mary Sullivan should reasonably possess. Nate lifted his eyes from the page, a smile touching the corners of his mouth in a way that made Eleanor's heart race irregularly. "You know Wordsworth, Mary. That's quite impressive for a simple farmer's daughter." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, desperately searching for a plausible explanation that wouldn't expose her charade even more. My previous employer in Iowa had a small library. Sometimes she allowed me to browse the books when I had finished my chores." It was a lie, but one that felt less heavy than her other lies, because it touched on a truth. She genuinely loved poetry, genuinely found solace and inspiration in the words of authors like Wordsworth, who understood the connection between the human spirit and the natural world. "I wandered lonely as a cloud," Nate recited softly, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and valued. That floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. His voice gave the familiar verses a hypnotic and deeply emotional quality, laden with a melancholy that made Eleanor's heart race with recognition. There was so much more to Nathaniel Blackthorne than met the eye, layers of education, sensitivity and pain that he kept carefully hidden under the mask of the practical rancher, just as she hid her own complexity under the simple exterior of Mary Sullivan. "You have a wonderful voice for poetry," she murmured, lowering her eyes to her embroidery to hide the confusion of feelings his recitation had awakened. "The words sound alive when you speak them. Sarah used to say that." The phrase came out without him seeming to intend it, and the silence that followed was dense with unsaid meanings that neither of them felt prepared to explore openly. Moses cleared his throat discreetly, putting aside the leather he was mending. "I think I'll go check if the horses are well sheltered from the storm," he said diplomatically, getting up with movements that somehow managed to be both casual and purposeful. "This wind is getting stronger." Eleanor knew perfectly well that Moses was deliberately giving them privacy, creating an opportunity for a conversation that might not happen under normal circumstances. For the first time since her arrival, she and Nate were completely alone together, with only the crackling of the fire and the wind outside, as witnesses to whatever words might be exchanged in an atmosphere that was increasingly charged with possibility. Would that night be the moment when the carefully constructed masks would finally begin to slip? And if that happened, what would be revealed underneath? Understanding and acceptance, or disappointment and rejection that would destroy the fragile foundation that was being built between them? The fire in the fireplace had been reduced to golden embers that pulsed like hypnotic heartbeats when Nate carefully closed the volume of Wordsworth and looked directly at Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel he could see through all the secrets she was carrying. The soft light of the dying embers danced on his face, softening the lines of tension he normally carried and revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, especially to someone he didn't yet completely trust. "May I ask you a personal question, Mary?" His voice was low, almost intimate in the extraordinary quietness of the room, where even the sounds of the wind outside seemed muffled and distant. Eleanor felt her heart pound with barely controlled panic. "Of course, Nate. Your hands." He discreetly gestured to her hands, which were holding the delicate embroidery. "They've never done much heavy physical work, have they? They're too soft and well cared for someone who supposedly spent her life working on a farm in Iowa." Eleanor looked at her own hands, hands that had never known real calluses, protected by silk gloves and cared for with expensive creams imported from Paris, maintained with regular manicures that kept them smooth as silk and white as alabaster. How could she have been so careless as not to have thought about such obvious evidence of her privileged origin? "Fej," she began, but the well-rehearsed lie died on her lips under his penetrating gaze, a gaze that was patient but also inexorable, as if he were prepared to wait as long as necessary for the truth. "And your way of speaking," Nate continued, leaning slightly forward in a way that was both intimidating and surprisingly gentle. "Sometimes you completely forget and use words, grammatical constructions, as if you had received a formal education, expensive education, the kind that farm families in Iowa simply can't afford." The silence stretched between them, like a fragile bridge over an abyss, and Eleanor felt the carefully constructed masks she had erected dissolving like sugar in the rain. Part of her was absolutely terrified, but another part, a part she didn't know existed until this moment, felt immense relief at the possibility of finally being completely honest with another human being. "You're not Mary Sullivan, are you?" The question was asked without accusation, only with genuine curiosity and an infinite patience that suggested he was willing to accept any truth she might offer, no matter how complicated or potentially dangerous it might be for both of them. Eleanor lowered the embroidery to her lap, her hands trembling slightly with emotions that had been suppressed for too long. "No," she whispered. "I'm not." "Then who are you really?" Eleanor lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no visible anger, only an infinite patience, as if he were prepared to accept any truth she might offer, no matter how complicated or potentially dangerous it might be for both of them. "My name is Eleanor Caldwell. I am the daughter of Judge Henry Caldwell of Boston." The words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam that had been holding back floodwaters for a long time. "I ran away from home to escape an arranged marriage to a man who—" She stopped, taking a deep breath to calm herself. "To a man who saw me as nothing more than an ornament for his fortune and a symbol of his social status." Nate leaned back in the armchair, processing this revelation with the same calm consideration she imagined he brought to all important decisions. "And why did you choose to come here? To a completely unknown rancher in the middle of nowhere in the mountains?" "Because your letters—" Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes, tears not of sadness, but of relief at finally being able to speak the complete truth. "Your letters spoke of dignity, of honest work, of a place where a person could be judged for what they are on the inside, not for what they possess or inherit. And what are you, Eleanor Caldwell?" The question echoed in the room like a gentle challenge that demanded not defensiveness, but true self-examination. Eleanor looked at the glowing embers in the fireplace, searching for words that would define her with more precision and honesty. "I am someone who has always wanted to be genuinely useful, who has always dreamed of making a real difference in the lives of people who need help, who believes that there is infinitely more to life than parlor balls and expensive dresses that serve no purpose other than display." When she looked up again, she found a smile on Nate's face that completely transformed his entire face, and knew instinctively that the truth, no matter how scary it was to reveal, had been absolutely the right choice. There was acceptance in his eyes and something more, something that looked extraordinarily like respect, for her courage to take enormous risks to create a life based on personal values rather than social expectations. But there were still more secrets that they both carried, and the night was still young for revelations that could change everything they thought they understood about themselves and about the dangerous complexities that surrounded the seemingly peaceful Moonrise Ranch. The days that followed Eleanor's confession brought a subtle but deeply significant change in the atmosphere of the ranch that all three inhabitants could feel, but no one addressed directly. Nate treated Eleanor with the same kindness and consideration as before, but there was now a new intimacy in their conversations, a trust that did not exist when she was still maintaining the elaborate charade of Mary Sullivan, the simple daughter of Iowa farmers. It was as if the truth had purified the air between them, removing barriers that had been unconsciously present even during their most relaxed moments together. Conversations flowed more naturally, laughter came more easily, and silences were comfortable rather than laden with unasked questions and careful evasions. "How you said you always wanted to help people," Nate commented one morning as they walked together through the stables, checking on animals that had endured a particularly cold night with the typical resilience of cattle raised in the mountains. "In Boston, could you really do that? Or was it more symbolic than practical?" Eleanor adjusted the warm shawl around her shoulders, protecting herself from the biting air that carried hints of more snow to come. The question touched on memories that were both painful and proud, actions that had finally led to her father's discovery of her activities and subsequent pressure to marry Cornelius Blackwood. "Secretly, yes. I helped some needy families with money and resources they needed to start their lives over after difficult circumstances. I also contributed to causes that—" She hesitated, remembering the risks she had taken, "that my father strongly disapproved of because they challenged social structures that benefited people like our family." "What kind of causes specifically?" Nate's voice carried genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she remembered how dangerous her activities had been, not only socially but potentially legally given the political climate of Bostonian society. Families of former slaves who needed assistance to settle after emancipation, women who were fleeing, abusive situations where they needed resources to escape and build new lives somewhere safe. Nate stopped walking completely, turning to face her with an intense expression that made her realize this topic had touched on something deeply important to him. "You really risked your comfortable social position to help the most vulnerable members of society." "It didn't seem like a real choice," Eleanor replied with the straightforward honesty that had become natural between them since her confession. "When you see suffering that you can alleviate with resources that you won't miss—" She shrugged slightly, as if it had been naturally obvious rather than socially revolutionary. "The money didn't mean anything important to me, but for them it meant a chance to start completely over." Something deep changed in Nate's eyes, a recognition, as if he saw in her a kindred spirit who instinctively understood principles that many people discussed, but few truly lived when it required personal sacrifice. "Eleanor, I need to show you something important," he said with sudden decision. "Something that will help you understand why I chose to build a life here, and why your courage in helping vulnerable people means more to me than you could possibly imagine." He guided her along a narrow trail that climbed the rocky slope behind the house, the path winding between tall pines and moss-covered stones that created natural steps on a slope that was both beautiful and slightly treacherous for someone unaccustomed to such terrain. Eleanor found herself breathing heavily due to both the physical effort and the thin air of the altitude, but also due to a growing sense that what Nate was planning to show her would represent another turning point in their rapidly deepening relationship. The trail led to a small hidden clearing where a modest cabin was nestled against a natural rock formation that provided both shelter and camouflage from anyone who might be looking for something they preferred to keep private. Smoke was rising from its chimney, and low voices could be heard reaching them in the thin mountain air. When they got closer, Eleanor saw a scene that left her absolutely breathless with surprise and a deep emotional response. An indigenous family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, was warming themselves around a modest fire, while Moses distributed blankets and food supplies with a silent efficiency that spoke of experience with this type of operation. "This family is on their way to Mexico," Nate explained in a low voice that would not reach anyone who might be listening from other directions. "They escaped from a government reservation where conditions were inhuman. The children were seriously ill, and the authorities were refusing to allow adequate medical treatment." Eleanor watched the scene with growing understanding, her heart breaking at the silent dignity of that family that had risked everything to protect their children. The woman held the smallest child against her chest, her large dark eyes conveying wordless gratitude to Moses, who clearly understood exactly what they needed most. "For you helped them escape," Eleanor whispered, finally understanding the full meaning of what she had stumbled upon. "Helping families like this has been my main purpose for 3 years. Nate confirmed, his voice carrying both pride and pain. "Since I lost Sarah and our daughter." Eleanor felt as if the ground had moved under her feet. "Daughter, Lily Moonfeather Blackthorn. She was 6 when—" Nate's voice came out taut with emotion. He clearly still struggled to control. "She and Sarah died in a fire at a school on the reservation. But I know it wasn't an accident, Eleanor. I know someone deliberately set that fire." The pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together in Eleanor's mind with stunning clarity. The pain in Nate's eyes that she had noticed since their first meeting, his dedication to helping indigenous families, the secret meetings, the carefully drawn maps. Everything made perfect sense when understood as part of a personal mission of justice and redemption. "That's why you do this," she murmured, looking again at the family in the cabin and feeling in a way she had never experienced before, for Sarah and Lily. "Every family that manages to reach Mexico safely is a promise I keep to Sarah and Lily," Nate confirmed simply. "It's my way of honoring their memory and fighting against a system that treats people as less than human, based purely on their race and cultural heritage." Eleanor absorbed this information, finally understanding the full complexity of the protection network that Nate had built over years of patient and dangerous work. "Isn't it extremely dangerous? Don't the government authorities suspect anything? There is always tremendous risk," Nate acknowledged, with a calm acceptance that spoke of a man who had carefully considered all the potential consequences and decided that some things were worth any danger. "But certain things transcend personal safety. You understand that perfectly, don't you? That's why you ran away from Boston. That's why you're here instead of safe in your father's mansion." Eleanor nodded, feeling a deep connection forming between them based on a shared understanding of what it meant to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended personal comfort or security. "I understand. Eleanor, there's something else important I need to tell you," he said, and the sudden seriousness in his voice made her stop working completely. "I received a letter today through our mail contact in town from a lawyer in Boston." The blood in Eleanor's veins turned to ice. "What kind of letter?" "Someone is actively looking for you, offering a substantial reward for any information about your whereabouts. The search is being conducted professionally, with resources that suggest serious money behind it." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The past she had so desperately tried to leave behind was approaching the mountains like a storm on the horizon, threatening to destroy everything she had found at Moonrise Ranch, not only her own fragile happiness, but also the safety of all the people who depended on the clandestine network that Nate had risked everything to create and maintain. A new phase of danger was beginning, one that would test the courage and commitment of all to principles they had affirmed they valued above their own lives. Eleanor realized that her personal escape from Boston had inadvertently brought enemies directly to a place where vulnerable people sought sanctuary, and that the choices she made next could determine not only her own destiny, but the safety of everyone she had come to love. The letter had arrived by the hands of a traveling merchant who made the regular route between Denver and the small mining towns scattered throughout the mountains. A man who was known for carrying both legitimate correspondence and occasional messages that people preferred to keep private from the government postal services. Nate handed it to Eleanor with a grave expression that immediately told her that life was about to change dramatically once again, watching carefully as she read the formal lines that transformed the temporary safety of the ranch into something fragile and potentially temporary. Wanted, Eleanor Caldwell, 32, daughter of Judge Henry Caldwell of Boston, disappeared since September. Generous reward for information leading to her safe whereabouts. Contact Cornelius Blackwood, Hotel Metropole, Denver. Eleanor felt the paper tremble in her hands as she read and reread the words that made her realize that distance alone had not been enough to escape the determination of men who were accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted, regardless of the desires or well-being of anyone else. He actually came all the way here. Cornelius actually traveled all the way to Colorado looking for me. Who exactly is this man? Nate asked, his voice carrying a tension she hadn't heard before, an edge that spoke of a man who had experience with dangerous people and situations that required careful strategy for survival. The man my father wanted me to marry. He is... Eleanor struggled to find adequate words to describe Cornelius Blackwood's particular brand of ruthless ambition. He is persistent beyond reason, and accustomed to getting what he wants through any means necessary. When Cornelius decides he wants something, he does not accept no as an answer that has any permanent validity. She folded the letter carefully, as if this simple action could somehow lessen the threat it represented to everyone at the ranch. He has extensive resources, political connections, and no moral reservations about using either to achieve his goals. If he's offering reward money, people will definitely look. Moses, who had entered the room silently during their conversation, completed. Especially here in the mountains where gold veins and silver deposits can disappear overnight, leaving families desperate. A real cash reward is worth more than any promise of mineral wealth that may never materialize. Eleanor got up abruptly, walking quickly to the window that offered a view of the snow-covered mountains. The world outside seemed immense and protective, but now she knew that not even those imposing rocky heights could hide her indefinitely from men with enough resources and determination. "I need to leave immediately," she said, her voice firmer than she truly felt inside. "I cannot put any of you in danger. If Cornelius finds out about what you're doing here, the consequences could be catastrophic for everyone." "You're not going anywhere," Nate declared with a firmness that did not admit argument or despair. "This is your home now, Eleanor, and we don't abandon family, regardless of what external threats may emerge." The word family hit her like lightning, bringing tears she desperately fought to hold back. In all her privileged years in Boston, surrounded by wealth and social connections, she had never experienced the genuine sense of belonging that this simple statement represented. "You don't completely understand," she protested, struggling to make them comprehend the full extent of the threat Cornelius represented. "Cornelius isn't just persistent, he's cruel when thwarted. If he finds out you helped me hide, then we'll have to make sure he doesn't make that discovery." A new voice interrupted from the entrance to the room. Eleanor turned to see Little Wolf standing on the threshold, his dark eyes shining with a determination that was both youthful and extraordinarily mature. Beside him was a middle-aged indigenous woman, with grey hair in traditional braids and an expression that radiated both ancient wisdom and practical intelligence that came from surviving numerous challenges that would have broken weaker spirits. "This is Anna Two Eagles," Little Wolf introduced with respect. She knew Sarah intimately. When she found out a woman was in danger at the ranch, "I came to offer help," Anna said in carefully pronounced English that was, however, clear and confident. "My people have known these mountains for many generations. We know hiding places that white men will never find, even with dogs and experienced trackers." Eleanor felt an overwhelming wave of emotion at the generosity of these people who barely knew her, but who were willing to risk their own safety to protect a stranger simply because she was in danger and had found refuge in a place they considered sacred. "I cannot accept such risks from any of you," she protested, even though a part of her desperately wanted to accept the protection they offered. "You've already risked too much." "Women who flee from cruel men are our sisters," Anna said, with a simple dignity that did not admit argument. "Sarah taught me this when we first met. Now we honor her memory by protecting you, even if it requires us to face dangers ourselves. Nate approached Eleanor, placing his hands gently on her shoulders, with a touch that was both protective and reassuring. You have a choice, Eleanor. You can run again, spend your whole life looking over your shoulder, always afraid. Or you can stay and allow those who care about you to help protect you. Eleanor looked into his blue eyes and saw there not only protection, but something infinitely deeper. Something that made her want to be brave for the first time in her life. Something that made her believe that together they could face any dangers that were approaching through the mountains, toward the sanctuary that had become more precious to her than any wealth or social status she had ever known. But first, they would need to find out exactly what Cornelius was planning, and if he had come alone or with allies who could represent even greater threats to everyone at the ranch and everyone who depended on their secret network for survival and freedom. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in an immaculate white mantle that reflected the light of the morning sun like millions of diamonds scattered across a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and ominous. Eleanor was in the kitchen, helping Moses prepare supplies for another refugee family that was expected to arrive within days, when little Wolf burst through the door with urgency clearly stamped on his typically composed features. "Men approaching on the main road," he reported quickly, his usually calm voice tense with strain. "3 riders. One of them is dressed like a city gentleman. Very expensive clothes completely unsuitable for mountain travel." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "Cornelius," she whispered, and the name emerged as both recognition and a prayer for strength. Nate entered the kitchen at that very moment, having heard the commotion and immediately recognizing from everyone's expressions that a serious problem was approaching quickly. "How many men in total, little Wolf?" 3. The well-dressed man from the city riding an expensive black horse, and 2 others who looked like professional hired gunmen, men accustomed to violence, openly carrying weapons, examining the mountains as if they expect an ambush or resistance. Eleanor moved to the window, peering cautiously through the lace curtains that Moses kept perfectly clean. Even from the considerable distance, she immediately recognized the elegant and predatory figure of Cornelius Blackwood, mounted on his black stallion, his expensive overcoat contrasting drastically with the rustic functionality of the mountain landscape. Beside him rode 2 hard-looking men, clearly accustomed to intimidation and violence, men who carried weapons with a casual familiarity that spoke of experience in using them when diplomacy failed to achieve desired results. "He found me," Eleanor murmured, her voice emerging taut with emotions that ranged from terror to fury at having her new life invaded by representatives of everything she had fled from. "No," Nate said, with a firmness that left no room for argument or despair. "He found Mary Sullivan. Eleanor Caldwell isn't here and never was." Moses quickly closed the curtains, blocking the view of anyone who might be observing the house from the outside. "The family's in the mountain cabin. Anna Two Eagles has already moved them to the secret cave system," Little Wolf reassured her efficiently. "They are completely safe from discovery, even if these men search for days." Eleanor stepped away from the window, feeling her heart beating with a rhythm that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly or make rational decisions under pressure. "You don't completely understand. Cornelius is extremely intelligent and experienced in getting what he wants. If he came all this distance, it's because he has solid evidence or strong suspicions. He must have bribed someone, gotten information through contacts. Then we will deal with whatever evidence he thinks he has," Nate declared calmly, his voice contrasting dramatically with the storm of emotions Eleanor was experiencing. "You are not alone this time, Eleanor. You have family now." The sound of approaching horses echoed clearly through the thin mountain air, creating an awareness that time for preparation was quickly running out. Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing deeply and trying to find the courage she knew existed somewhere inside her, buried under years of conditioning to avoid confrontation and submit to male authority. "I can do this," she whispered to herself as much as to anyone else. "I can be brave when it matters." Moses discreetly checked through the gap in the curtain again. They stopped in front of the house. The city gentleman is dismounting, adjusting his clothes. He looks confident, like someone who expects to get exactly what he came for. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, adjusting the simple dress she was wearing and tying her apron around her waist with movements that were deliberately calm and controlled. If she was going to face Cornelius, it would be as the woman she had become, not as the scared girl who had fled Boston months earlier. "No matter what he says, what threats he makes," Nate said silently, positioning himself where he could observe but not intimidate. "Remember that you have every right to choose your own life and future." The heavy knock echoed through the house like cannon fire, reverberating in a suddenly silent atmosphere where everyone held their breath. Eleanor walked toward the door with steps that were firm, despite the trembling she felt throughout her body. This would be the moment that would define not only her immediate future, but the type of woman she would choose to be for the rest of her life, one who bowed to the expectations and threats of others, or one who stood bravely firm in her right to determine her own destiny, no matter what the final cost might be. When she reached the doorknob, she could hear Cornelius's voice from outside, smooth, confident, carrying unmistakable undertones of barely controlled anger that made her realize this confrontation would be even more dangerous than she had anticipated. But she also heard behind her the silent sounds of people who cared about her positioning themselves to offer whatever support might be necessary. For the first time in her entire life, Eleanor Caldwell was not facing danger completely alone. Eleanor opened the door with the serene dignity she had learned by observing the indigenous women she had met at the ranch, a quietness that came not from resignation or defeat, but from an inner strength based on a deep connection to principles more important than personal safety or social approval. Cornelius Blackwood was on the wooden porch exactly as she remembered him from Boston, tall, impeccably dressed despite the long journey, with that predatory smile that had always made her feel like helpless prey captured by a hunter who took pleasure in the anticipation of the capture. Behind him were the two hired men she had never seen before, but whose presence was clearly intended to intimidate and discourage resistance. They were not subtle about the weapons they were carrying, making it clear that this visit was not intended as gentle persuasion or civilized negotiation. "Eleanor, my dear," Cornelius said, with a voice that was superficially smooth but carried unmistakable undertones of satisfaction at having achieved his goal. "What a tremendous relief to finally find you safe after so much worry and unease." "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor retorted with a slight nod of her head, as if he were just an ordinary visitor deserving of basic courtesy, but no particular deference or fear. "What a surprise to see you so far from Boston. A very long journey indeed. I came to find you, naturally. Your father is absolutely distraught with concern for your safety." His eyes moved past her shoulder, observing the simple interior of the house with obvious disdain. "I can see you were forced to accept rather primitive accommodations during your adventure." "I found a home here," Eleanor replied with a simplicity that carried no defensiveness, just a statement of fact. Cornelius laughed, a sound without genuine humor. "A home? Eleanor, you are the daughter of Judge Caldwell. You were born for elegant parlors and sophisticated society, not for this rustic, primitive existence." Nate appeared at the entrance to the room, positioning himself slightly behind Eleanor, close enough to provide support if necessary, but respecting her autonomy to handle the situation herself. His presence was comforting, without being intrusive. "Mr. Blackwood," Nate said politely, "I am Nathaniel Blackthorne. I believe you've already met my wife." Eleanor felt a shock of gratitude for the implicit protection in the word wife, even though she knew it was a purely strategic maneuver, intended to provide legal and social protection. Cornelius studied Nate with eyes that were calculating and disdainful. "Wife? How interesting. And when exactly did this union occur?" "2 weeks ago," Eleanor lied without hesitation, discovering to her surprise that the lie came easily when employed to protect rather than manipulate. "A simple ceremony, as befits simple people with honest values." "Simple," Cornelius repeated the word, as if it had an unpleasant taste in his mouth. "Eleanor, you can't be serious about this charade. Come with me now, and we'll arrange to dissolve any legal complications you may have created. Your father is prepared to forgive your temporary insanity." "There is nothing to forgive," Eleanor said, feeling courage growing in her chest like a natural spring of determination she never knew she possessed. "For the first time in my life, I made a choice that was genuinely my own." "Choice?" Cornelius took a step forward, his civilized mask beginning to slip and reveal something darker underneath. "You have no right to choose, Eleanor. You were born with obligations to your family, your social class. You cannot simply run away to play rancher with this... Be careful with your words," Nate warned, his voice low but carrying unmistakable authority that made Cornelius's hired men shift uncomfortably. Cornelius ignored the warning completely, focusing all his attention on Eleanor with an intensity she remembered from her few social interactions in Boston. "You will come with me now, or I will be forced to take less diplomatic measures to ensure your safe return." Eleanor looked at this man who had once terrorized her with his demands and expectations and felt pity. Pity for someone so spiritually small that he could only feel powerful by controlling others. Someone so emotionally impoverished that he confused possession with affection. "Cornelius," she said gently, "I am not your property. I never was. And I will not become your possession, regardless of what threats you may make." "We'll see about that," he said coldly, making a gesture toward his armed companions. It was then that little Wolf appeared calmly from the side of the house, followed by Moses and 3 more indigenous men whom Eleanor did not recognize. All of them carried rifles with the easy familiarity of people who knew how to use them efficiently when circumstances required it. Anna Two Eagles emerged from behind the stable building, her dignified presence somehow more intimidating than all the weapons combined. "Gentlemen," Moses said politely, "I believe the lady has made her position quite clear. There doesn't seem to be anything more to discuss." Cornelius looked around, clearly recognizing for the first time that he was at a decided numerical disadvantage and that his hired protection was insufficient to guarantee success through intimidation or violence. "This is not over, Eleanor," he said, backing toward his horse with movements that tried to maintain dignity while acknowledging defeat. "Your father has considerable political influence. I will return with legal authorities." "If you return," Eleanor said firmly, "you will find the same answer. This is my home, this is my family, and this is my choice." She watched Cornelius and his men mount their horses and ride away from the ranch, disappearing around the bend in the mountain trail that would take them back to whatever world of privilege and coercion they represented. Only when they were completely out of sight did she allow her knees to tremble with the adrenaline-fueled reaction to the confrontation that had demanded every ounce of courage she possessed. "It's over," Nate whispered, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and celebratory. "No," Eleanor said, looking at the mountains that had taken her in when she needed sanctuary. "Now it's truly beginning." 6 months later, Eleanor Blackthorne, for she and Nate had married in a genuine ceremony that beautifully combined Christian traditions with indigenous customs honoring Sarah's memory, was in the garden she had planted behind the house, watching the first spring flowers bloom among the rocks. The Moonrise Foundation, created with the gold from the mine her Uncle James had left her through his mysterious map, had already helped dozens of families find safe homes where they could live with dignity and freedom. The transformation in her life was so complete that sometimes Eleanor had to stop and breathe deeply to believe it was real. Her hands, once soft as silk and protected by expensive gloves, now carried the honest calluses of genuine work, marks of dignity that she wore with pride. Her face, tanned by the mountain sun, radiated a satisfaction she had never known in the perfumed parlors of Boston. Nate approached from behind, wrapping her in his strong arms with a warm familiarity that still made her heart race even after months of marriage. "What are you thinking about? How strange life can be," she murmured, leaning against his chest and inhaling the comforting aroma of pine and honest work that always accompanied him. "I spent my whole life trying to escape golden cages, and I only found true freedom when I stopped running and started fighting for what I believed in." He kissed the top of her head gently, a gesture that had become a daily ritual between them. "The mountains teach that lesson, that real strength comes not from avoiding storms, but from learning to dance in the rain when it falls." Eleanor smiled, watching little Wolf teach a Ute child to ride in the corral, while Moses and Anna Two Eagles planned the next safe route for a family that would arrive the following week. The protection network they had built was now a sophisticated and efficient operation, a literal lifeline for people who had no other options. "Sometimes I still can't believe all this is real," Eleanor confessed, observing the peaceful activity around the ranch, "that I found a place where I can be completely myself." "And what place is that?" Nate asked with tenderness. Eleanor looked around at the eternal mountains that rose like protective sentinels, at the people who had become her chosen family, at the blossoming garden she had planted with her own hands. "Home," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I am truly home." The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the aromas of melting snow, wildflowers, and infinite possibilities. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt something that had taken her 32 years to find, complete peace with herself and with her place in the world. In the distance, a falcon circled high among the snow-capped peaks, its extended wings catching the air currents that lifted it higher and higher. Eleanor watched its dance with the invisible currents and understood that she had learned the same art, How to use the forces that once scared her to rise to heights she had never imagined possible. "You know what I've discovered?" she said, turning in Nate's arms to face him. "True freedom is not the absence of responsibilities. It is choosing which responsibilities are worth taking on." Nate smiled, that transformative smile that still made her heart race. "And you chose well." Eleanor looked once more at the mountains that had taken her in, at the people who had accepted her, at the life she had built through courage she didn't even know she possessed. She had traded golden cages for honest work, empty privilege for true purpose, artificial security for genuine love. And she had discovered that when a person finally stops running from herself and starts fighting for what she believes in, the whole world opens up like a flower blooming in the sun. The future stretched ahead, like an unexplored trail climbing the mountains, challenging, uncertain, but infinitely promising. Eleanor Caldwell Blackthorne was ready for whatever adventure came next, because she had finally found something for which any risk was worth it. A life lived on her own terms, surrounded by people who loved her exactly as she was. The mountains echoed with her laughter when Nate picked her up in his arms and spun her around, both laughing like children under the immense sky that promised infinite possibilities for those brave enough to embrace them. This world she had chosen was not perfect, but it was genuinely hers. And for the first time in her entire life, Eleanor Caldwell Blackthorne knew exactly who she was and where she belonged, not because someone had defined those things for her, but because she had discovered them through her own courage to choose love over comfort, principles over security, and authenticity over social approval. Looking at the eternal mountains that surrounded her chosen home, she knew she had finally found what her restless soul had always sought without knowing it, a place where she could be completely herself, and people who valued her exactly for who she was, not for what she represented or possessed. This was true freedom, not an escape from responsibility, but a choice to take responsibility for creating a life based on genuine values rather than external expectations. And it was worth every risk she had taken to achieve it. As the sun set behind the snow-capped peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that no artist could fully capture, Eleanor knew she had found her forever in those icy mountains that held the most precious secret of all, that the courage to be truly herself was the greatest treasure any person could discover.